All right, so what we're talking about is graphs, and we're trying to get a clear understanding of when you use a bar graph and when you use a histogram, and what the differences are when you look at them. This is a bar graph. It's comparing qualitatively different groups by some quantitative amount. Okay? So we're separating them in bars like this because there's no numerical value that sort of fits in here. Okay? These are qualitatively different groups we're comparing. Okay? So this is a true bar graph, and that's what you use a bar graph for, to compare groups that are different qualitatively, not quantitatively. There are always exceptions to every rule, but that's the rule. Okay? That you're going to compare qualitatively different groups by some numerical, quantitative, if you will, difference. Okay? So then, that's different from a histogram. A histogram is a grouping that essentially looks at a distribution curve. So what we have are actual values down here, and we're saying, okay, everything that fits between this value and this value is in this bar. So we're grouping amounts. This is a normal distribution curve. Actually, this is not perfectly normal because it slightly leans to the left. Okay, and Dr. Terry went over what you call that when it's not a perfectly normal distribution. Okay, but a histogram is showing the data that fits a distribution curve. Okay, sometimes we call that a bell curve. Right? So we're looking at things that might be outliers tucked into these corners down here when we're looking at this kind of distribution. So a histogram is used when you're looking at data that can be compared starting with the mean in the middle, or whatever the mean is in this case, okay, and the quartile divisions by quartiles and so forth. All right, all those statistical analyses we did, standard deviation and so forth, those are all based on this kind of data. If we were to take this and, I mean, you could take and probably pretty easily draw out the distribution curve here just by looking at the peaks of all these things. Okay, there's a distribution curve. All right, but what you do with a distribution curve is you're actually grouping together sets of data. Now sometimes if it's counting numbers, you actually have all the numbers that fit right here, but sometimes they're measurements too. And so you have to group a certain set of measurements together and divide them up into a reasonable graduation. Okay, but that's a histogram. The difference between a bar graph and a histogram is a histogram is looking at a distribution curve. Okay, that's what it's used for. And so a bar graph that happens to be a distribution curve is no longer called a bar graph. We call it a histogram. Okay, a bar graph compares those things that are qualitatively different. Okay, bar graphs are used for some of the same type of data as you would use for you'd use a pie graph for. So a pie graph is comparing, in this case, and this is very common, is comparing percentages for different qualitatively different groups. Okay, there's no numerical difference between blue M&Ms and yellow M&Ms here. We're just counting the number of yellow M&Ms and blue M&Ms in packages. Okay, so it's just comparing out of the total available M&Ms that you find in a typical or in a collection of M&M packages. This is the distribution of those things. Okay, I don't know why they're more blue than red M&Ms. I don't get it. Blue is better. Okay. Oh, really? Maybe it. Is it really? You're kidding. There's some psychological or sociological study, but oh my gracious. You're kidding. Yeah, I need to find the research on that. That's pretty cool. I did not know that. So y'all taught me something new. All right. Now, the typical graph that you get from most research, not every research, because some of you are doing groupings of research, you're going to be using histograms. All right? But if you're comparing one clear variable for which there is a range of measurements against another variable for which there is a range of measurements, you're going to have a scatter graph. Now maybe yours will look more like a line or a curve than this one does. This looks like a pretty good scatter. Okay? But this is a scatter graph. That's what a scatter graph is used for. It's comparing, like like the calibration curve we produced in this class. That's a scatter graph. All right, we're looking at how something that has a true variable down here, true independent variable, can be compared against a true dependent variable. That is, you can have an infinite number of changes along this x-axis, the independent variable axis, versus the vertical axis, the dependent variable axis. Okay, you can break it down as many finer and finer points if you wanted to. Okay, and get more and more data that fits on this graph. Okay. Now this can actually be numerically or mathematically predicted. That is, you can use this to make predictions about future measurements, because if you have a best fit line or curve, looks to me it fits right about here. Okay. Now you have something against which you can predict future tests or future repeats of these experiments. We can actually say, okay, within this range, our pattern fits along that best fit line. Okay, and we can expect all future measurements, unless there's something wrong with the way we did it. Okay, all future measurements should fit right there, because that makes the most sense. That's what we can gather from this distribution here. Okay, this is a positive relationship between independent and dependent variable. A positive relationship between dependent and independent variable. Okay, it's also called a positive correlation between those two variables. All right, if the data went on a slant like this, on a almost straight line slant that's going downhill, so a negative slant, okay, that's called a negative correlation. So this is a positive correlation, a negative correlation. Now that's different from the relationship between the two variables. Okay, if I have a set of data that looks like this, that's not a negative correlation. That's an inverse variation. Okay, so this is a behavior that you often see in nature. Anytime when the independent variable is increasing, the dependent variable is decreasing. If it's on a very simple sort of mathematical relationship to do it, where we have something like, well, P times V equals K, some constant here. That's true. I could put that over there. Okay, but when we're comparing just pressure against volume, we get it equal to some constant. It should be a little k, not a capital K. Okay, that would make this inverse variation. Okay, so there's a difference between correlation and variation. Okay, if you're comparing several groups of data, then you need a line graph. If you're looking at several groups of data, you need a line graph. Okay, this is called a line graph. Sometimes, as a shortcut way of explaining it, I'll call this a connect the dots graph. Does that make sense? I mean, it looks like connect the dots, doesn't it? And what we're seeing is a relationship between the patterns, okay, for different sets of data. In this case, we're looking at how plant stem length is affected by various amounts of time in the wind. 30 mile a minute's wind. What is that? No wind. I don't know what minutes means anyway here, but anyway, we're comparing different sets of data. Okay? Now, it might be, if you're doing this experiment, you actually need this graph and 4 more, because you might want to compare this set of data completely separately from this set of data, and completely separate from this set of data, and so forth. It depends on what you're studying. You with me, Adam? Okay? So, you've got to think through, when you're doing your analysis, what is it my information can be used to tell somebody? What can it be used for? Sometimes you need a lot of graphs to do that. Sometimes you just need one. One will do it. Okay? But if you're comparing different sets of data on a true independent versus dependent type variable, okay, then you may need a line graph. All right? It is possible that you'll have 4 different scatter graphs in here. Of course, you'll have color coding to do that, and you have a best fit curve or line to fit all those things. That might be a better way to represent that data. Okay, but this is a typical often used for that purpose. Does that make sense to everybody? All right. Suppose I've got different histograms. So like this graph here is comparing 4 different sets of data. Suppose I've got distribution curves for 4 related sets of data. How in the world am I supposed to compare 4 of these together on the same graph? Well, that's what a box and whisker plot is for. Okay? So the box and whisker plot is basically a distribution curve, or several different distribution curves compared at the same time. So when you look at a box and whisker plot, what you're looking at is this darkened line is usually the one, it may be here, it might be here, but wherever the darkened line is, that's the median of that data. So if we were doing a normal distribution curve, we'd have it, that'd be where our peak would be. Okay? And so in this case, we have a kind of a shifted set of data. Okay, we got almost a hill with a cliff over here. All right? But here's your interquartile median here, and it turns out the median and interquartile median on the top side here is at the same point on this data because it's a small set of data. The highest point in the data is here, so that's where you tend to find those outliers down here and down here. Okay, so if we were drawing this, we'd draw a curve that looks something like that. All right, it wouldn't be a good distribution curve, would it? But very often you're comparing different groups, and you need to compare the distribution curves for those different groups, and that becomes a little bit complex to follow on a regular graph, like by drawing a normal curve. You know, where you have this, and you're comparing a normal distribution curve against another normal distribution curve and another normal distribution, and after a while it's kind of hard to keep up with all of it. So that's what the box and whisker plot is designed to help you see. Okay, so what we have here, here's the median for this set of data. Okay, here are the 2 interquartile medians, and there's the end of our data curve where our outliers might or might not be. Okay, and here's another distribution curve, median. Okay, so we had to have a peak here, and it's sloping down to these points here. So we're comparing those different distribution curves on one large graph, but this is a little bit easier graphical representation to see how they're related. Does that make sense to you? Okay. All right. Now, box and whisker plots, frequency distributions, distribution curves, histograms, line graphs. Let's see, is there anything else that'll leave out of that set? Oh, here we go. Scatter graphs. They're all used for comparing quantitative data against quantitative data. Okay, now the box and whisker plot is kind of a combination of all that. Because what we did was we separated out qualitative groups, but we have it compared. We're comparing the qualitative data for a graph that in this case, is kind of turned sideways. We have a distribution curve that we turned up sideways. So in a sense, we are comparing both qualitative data and to an independent variable type of data, an X and Y graph, all in one thing. Does that make sense? Okay. So this is used for comparing both quantitative data and qualitative data all at the same time. Okay. And so are histograms, so are scatter graphs, so are line graphs. Okay. Whereas bar graphs and pie graphs should be used almost exclusively for comparing qualitatively different groups. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, I know a lot of you did the quiz at home and did pretty well, but the biggest mistakes that I saw were understanding the difference between a bar graph and a histogram. Okay. Is there anybody who has any questions about the difference between a bar graph and a histogram? Okay. Does anybody not understand how we are actually comparing qualitative and quantitative differences in a box and whisker plot? Okay, now's the time to, and of course you can ask later, but you need to know when you use these different graphs and for what purpose. Okay?